Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by James Copley, and we might be in the middle of an international break, but we've still got plenty of Sunderland things to be discussing, James. We'll start with a pretty disappointing week, I think it's fair to say, from Sunderland last time out. Obviously, a 1-1 draw at home to Preston North End, and then a really heavy defeat against Coventry City away from home on Saturday. I mean, two results that obviously aren't ideal in terms of what it means for Sunderland in the league table, but also weren't necessarily ideal in terms of performance either.
No, I think both results probably now mean that Sunderland's top two chances are over. It was looking slim anyway, but I think at one point Sunderland were like 8 points behind, and that now it's down to 11 or something like that. I haven't got the league table in front of me, but yeah, Preston at home was disappointing. They didn't seem to turn up. Obviously, great equaliser from Mundell. I think Coventry away was quite concerning. I thought their atmosphere at home was absolutely superb. They looked like a team bang up for in form with momentum. They look like they've really bought into what Frank Lampard's done, and they just really turned Sunderland over. They seem to want it more. Sunderland seem to be a team going through the motions. As I say, I think that sort of home atmosphere really seemed to impact Sunderland. They couldn't get the foot on the ball. Yeah, just outworked them, outmuscled them. And there was a lot of Sunderland players who were under par. They look a bit jaded at the moment, which is obviously not ideal going into the end of the season and a potential playoff campaign. And I think what's concerning from a Sunderland perspective as well was that we haven't really seen a performance like that since the back end of last season. Obviously, Sunderland lost the last two home games against Sheffield Wednesday 2-0, which was a pretty meek performance. And they also lost against Blackburn Rovers, didn't they? 5-1. That was pretty poor as well towards the back end of the season. And I hadn't really felt like that after a Sunderland game since then, really, until the game against Coventry away. So it is a little bit worrying. I think there's a little bit of recency bias there. It's two bad results in what has otherwise been a decent season. You know, listeners may have tuned into the Daniel Story podcast we did the other day, the national report from the newspaper. And, you know, as it stands, Sunderland are on course to finish the highest out of any team in the country without Premier League money or parachute payments, which is an achievement in itself, given where Sunderland have come from. But you just felt like at times this season there's been a little bit more there for Sunderland, and perhaps with a few more players, a little bit more luck, a few less injuries. The top two could have been there to have been attacked, but I don't think it's meant to be. That saying, there is a potential playoff campaign to come. But it's whether Sunderland can now sort themselves back out. Because I often think, Jace, that like once you've peaked on the momentum mountain for a season and you start coming back down the other side, I think it's very hard to like peak again. I'm not saying it's impossible by any means, but like you'd rather Sunderland would just like steady away and then took it to the playoffs and took it to another level in the playoffs rather than sort of come down the other side of the mountain and struggle and go through the motions for a couple of weeks. But a bit of positivity is probably needed because I do think over two legs that Sunderland can just about beat anybody in the division. I think I really truly believe that. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. But yeah, it's just a shame really because the season just seems to have stalled and stuttered a little bit.
Yeah, I think you make some very, very valid points. I think the Coventry game was almost a bit of an eye-opener because, like you sort of alluded to there, it was the first time where we've genuinely seen Sunderland, I mean, for want of a better word, capitulate this season. You know, they've obviously had disappointing results, but more often than not, you know, they've sort of at least hung in the game and been there or thereabouts, you know, come the end of the contest. I mean, it's the first time that they've lost a game by 2 or more goals since May of last year, I think.
May 4th. Yeah.
You know, I think that tells its own story, doesn't it? Where even when, you know, and look, there have been disappointing results this season, but even in those matches, Sunderland have not been a million miles away. Equally, there have been disappointing performances, but there have been times where Sunderland have still managed to come out of those games with, whether it is even just a draw, they've come out with something to show for it. Whereas this was the first time where we sort of got the worst of both, if you like, where it was a bad performance and a bad result to match as well. And I think the key word that you mentioned there is momentum, because it is going to be something that people are talking about a lot, that they've already spoken about a lot. With, recording this on Thursday, we're several days removed from the Coventry City match now. And one of the key questions that I've sort of seen doing rounds is, like, what does this mean for Sunderland's momentum? And I think it's a fair one as well, because I think you're right. Like, at this moment in time, I don't think it's particularly out of line to suggest that Sunderland will very, very probably be in the playoffs. And you do want to be going into those two semi-final legs feeling as if you've got the bit between your teeth. And obviously, if Sunderland were to put in another few performances like the one we saw against Coventry City, then you would have to say that they wouldn't necessarily be inspiring confidence in that regard. That being said, there's every chance that, this could just be a blip. I think you make, again, a very valid point about a lot of players looking a little bit jaded, perhaps a little bit fatigued. It's been a very long season with a very young squad. And I do think that it was always an inevitability that at some point it was going to catch up with Sunderland a little bit. And to that end, I sort of wonder if the result against Coventry, if it were to happen, probably couldn't have happened at a better time. And what I mean by that is that obviously you go and lose that game, but then you have, with the vast majority of the squad at least, a fortnight on the training ground before they're back in action against Millwall on the 29th. You know what I mean? And it gives you a chance to perhaps rest, recuperate. I know obviously some players have gone away on international duty, but it does give you a chance to sort of gather yourself a little bit and to maybe just steady the ship and perhaps sort of just reassert the idea that actually one bad result does not make for a promotion push, which is sort of crashing. You know what I mean?
You're absolutely right, because, like, we try and call a spade on this podcast, don't we? And we highlight bad performances, we highlight good performances. But yes, it's frustrating, but there's no reason to panic, is there really? Like, Sunderland's, as you say, Sunderland's top six spot is definitely assured. If this turns into a little bit of a pattern and continues, Sunderland losing games by more than a 1-goal margin or losing a number of games on the spin, then yes, you can start to get concerned. But it is worth noting, as we did earlier on the podcast, that it's been a really, really good season. I think the frustration comes from as well is that perhaps this has been coming. We'd seen Sunderland look a bit jaded in a few games recently, and one of the main criticisms I think of this Sunderland side is that although they don't lose many games by more than a 1-goal margin, they don't really win many games by more than a 1-goal margin either. It's only happened really a few times this season, and that's no bad thing. But I thought, Jace, at one point this season, around the Sheffield United game at home, maybe on New Year's Day, I thought that Sunderland team looked like it had the potential to maybe step up a few levels and start really putting teams to the sword, start really being clinical. I thought around that time that somebody was due a hiding, and it didn't seem to happen. You're right to mention that this squad is very young, because it is, and I think sometimes Sunderland do lower the level to play teams. I'm thinking of like the Plymouth game, both Plymouth games, Hull City game at the stadium of like Preston. Like, all respect to those teams who've played well against Sunderland. You have to say that tactically they've set up well, but sometimes feel like Sunderland sort of get dragged into a dogfight when they don't need to. They just need to let the quality shine through, and that's the characteristics you're going to get with a young side. And fans of every club will say this as well, but Sunderland have had a few injury issues, as you mentioned. I do think the break's coming at a good time. Lebris will get a bit of time to work on them on the training pitch, but they're actually away at the moment. I don't think there's anybody playing staff-wise, maybe other than the injured players at the academy of like currently. I don't think they'll be back in till next week, which I think is a good thing, just mentally and physically, to be able to reset. They've played a lot of football, haven't they? And there's been a fair few ups and downs this season. So I think, Millwall at home is a tough test, isn't it, really? Alex Neil coming back to the stadium of light where he's not well liked, and he's won before, hasn't he? So won against Sunderland before by a large scoreline when he was Stoke City boss. So that'll be interesting. Millwall are always difficult to play against, but you'd like to see Sunderland come up with a reaction now. And a lot of these lads are playing, like, they're very talented young players, but you're playing for your future this season as well, in terms of your standing in the game. They're all looking upwards. Chris Rigg, Joe Bellingham. I'm not saying that they're eyeing the next transfer deal or anything like that. That's not the headline, but they're all playing for big futures in the game. They've all been tipped for England honours and international call-ups and big moves to Europe and all of this. And let's be honest, that might not happen with Sunderland. These things probably won't happen with the Sunderland. They'll probably not play in European competitions with Sunderland. I'd love it to happen, but it's unlikely. They probably won't get called up with Sunderland. So they're now playing now to prove that hype, and hopefully that could be quite a powerful thing, and they can sort of get Sunderland into a playoff campaign. What does worry me though is like the potential narratives in that playoff campaign, like playing a Coventry again. I do not like at all, because they just was quite abundantly clear at the CBS Arena that they just absolutely hate us, and I think the feeling from Sunderland fans is probably mutual, but it almost felt like a derby. It was strange. They just really, really do not like us. And there's a lot of history there. So them over two legs against a team where just everything seems to go wrong all of the time for us, I wouldn't fancy. And then there's like Tony Mowbray's West Brom as well, just kicking around. Middlesbrough aren't that far off it. And I'm just like, any of those three, I'm just thinking that could be like an absolute nightmare. And it's probably come back to bite me, but like, just give me Bristol City or something where there's not that much history with, and there's not that much needle and bite about it, because I think the other three really concern me in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, Sunderland are going to Sunderland, aren't they? I think it's fair to say that, they always find new ways. Yeah, look, I think what you're saying about narratives is really pertinent, and what I would sort of bring into that as well is that, the mood around the club, or at least around the fan base, I mean, like over the past few days since that Coventry match, when you contrast that to the sort of buoyancy that accompanied that late push into the playoffs under Mowbray. Now, I know obviously circumstances are different, but there are also similarities. There was a lack of expectation heading into the season, or at least a lack of belief that someone could sort of perform to a level where they would be in any sort of contention for a promotion push. That was true after they'd just come up from League One, and I think it's probably fair to say that in the eyes of many, it was true when the Briss first came in as well. But the difference was that, that late push towards the playoffs under Mowbray, I felt like they were chasing something. I felt like they were really striving to get to somewhere that they didn't necessarily have a right to be. Whereas because of the way that the season has panned out this time, and because of the fact that Sunderland have been so assured in a playoff spot for so long, but also chasing automatic promotion for so long, and then that's fallen away over the past month or so. Like, obviously, for a little while it's been in doubt, but in terms of realistic, like, if we're talking realistic chances of making it over the past few weeks, it has really sort of deteriorated. I just wonder how that affects the sort of mentality side of it, where you go from having this real aspirational feel under Mowbray to perhaps having to contend with a little bit of disappointment that you haven't quite reached the top two, when in reality, if we're calling a spade, Sunderland are in a stronger position than they were that promotion push under Mowbray. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind the mad if somebody fancies, uninjuring him and send him to Sunderland. That would be lovely.
Yeah. Oh God, can you imagine right now?
The funny thing about that season, though, Jace, is I touched upon it. I touched upon it earlier. So around the same time in that season under Mowbray, Sunderland lost against Alex Neil's Stoke City at the stadium of like 5-1, and still made the playoffs. And I think they went like unbeaten in quite a few. I haven't got time to count it, but it's interesting, isn't it, that sometimes you do get these little results in a season, and you are able to push on. Like, I'm trying to cast my mind back, but I'm like, after we got beaten 5-1 against Stoke City in that season, I doubt you could find many people saying that Sunderland would make the playoffs, because for ages it just didn't look like they were going to, did they? And I think certainly this team is, although I really liked that team and I had some really good players in like Clark and Ahmad. Obviously Stewart was injured by then. I do think this team has a little bit more about it, especially up front with Mayenda and Wilson Isidore. So I do think there's a lot to be positive about. I do get the frustrations, because I feel like, because of Sunderland's history in the Championship and the Premier League in our lifetimes, and in the lifetimes of many supporters, and given the size of the club where it's historically resided within the football pyramid, when there's a chance to get promoted, you really want to see the club take it. And, expectation and impatience can rear its ugly head, and understandably so, because success has been few and far between, hasn't it? Especially spending 4 seasons in League One. We also had COVID, and we've seen other teams do really, really well just in general, like the Brighton and the Brentfords of this world, and you sort of feel there's no reason Sunderland can't have that, really, and it sort of makes you want it all the more the closer you get. And I think that's where that impatience comes from, is a sort of a real want to see this club back where it belongs.
Definitely. And I think you're right when you say it as well, that part of the thing this season is that that's been exacerbated by the fact that there have been so many instances where Sunderland have felt so close to going to that next level. And I mean, you sort of mentioned around the turn of the year and the Sheffield United result, and how it felt as if Sunderland were maybe simmering and bubbling up towards something a little bit more. I mean, what I would say about that is that I actually think that they've been unfortunate, not just with injuries, but then also like the areas of the pitch in which they've sustained those injuries. So what I mean by that is that, if you think about, we constantly talk about the need to sort of rest and rotate that young midfield three, Dan Neil, Joe Bellingham, Chris Rigg. I'm sure that Lebris would have been a lot more forthcoming in that if he'd been able to rely upon an Alan Brown, who was missing since November, or if he'd been able to get Salis Abdul Samed up to full speed. But we've never really seen that this season, and it's limited his options. You could say a similar thing about Patrick Roberts out on the right wing. Ian Fader's not been fit enough, consistently enough, to give him a proper break. I know obviously Mayenda played out there a little bit, and there have been times that he's tried to mix it up, but I think it's evident that nobody aside from Roberts, in terms of the current contingent who are actually fit and match ready, nobody apart from Roberts would see that as their preferred position. And I think, that has been a thorn in the side of Lebris. And I do think that what it's ultimately meant is that if Sunderland had that full depth available, if they'd had that full strength and those reserves to be able to call upon, who's to say what they might have been able to do? But there have been times this season where Lebris has kind of had to work with one hand tied behind his back. And I think it's credit to him that it's perhaps not spoken about a great deal, because Sunderland have generally managed to keep on trundling along quite nicely, or at least nicely enough to a point where they're still in the playoff, the promotion picture, but certainly the playoff picture with, 8 games to go now, So there have been tricky, extenuating circumstances. And I do think you're right. I think because of those extenuating circumstances, it's the carrot on the end of the stick, isn't it?
It is
dangling just there, and you can't.
And a lot of those games, Jace, as well. Like Sunderland have been unlucky. Like Sheffield United away, like what on earth happened there? Sunderland probably should have won that. They lost it in the last minute. There have been a lot of last minute goals, which I guess you could argue does become a little bit of a trend after a while. But yeah, I completely agree. And a lot of Sunderland's bad results before, like the Coventry result, and then maybe it's like the Hull and Plymouth results at home, a lot of the bad results, you could argue, like there were mitigating circumstances. And just to touch on Lebris as well, you mentioned him sort of doing it with one arm tied behind his back in terms of injuries and stuff like that. I also think like he's learning on the job as well massively. It's his first season in English football. He's done very well, but it's a strange old game over here in the Championships, like a hugely competitive league with a lot of games. I remember when Lebris first came to the club, all he could mention was like the amount of games, the amount of games. He kept saying like the amount of games you have to play in this league is crazy, is pretty much what he was intimating. And it is in a way, and I think he's had to learn on the job that, teams in the Championship, they will bring physical players on to change the game all at once, like a bomb squad in the second half. And they're not just going to let you sit on a lead and play your pretty football. They're going to try and disrupt that. You're going to go away to Coventry, and you might not realise that there's a bit of a rivalry between Coventry and Sunderland, and when you get there, they're going to make it ridiculously uncomfortable for you. And I think he's just sort of slowly learning little bits and pieces, whilst, to be honest, still haven't done quite a good job. But he's extremely studious, and like the injuries as well. Like Dan Ballard's been out for pretty much the majority of the season, hasn't he? One way or the other, he's returned for a few. Like people forget that not long ago we were talking about him as one of the best defenders in the league. He's absolutely superb on his day, and probably would be in the Premier League already if it wasn't for his injury issues. But I still think there's a lot to like about the season. There's a lot to like about Lebris. there's no reason to throw the baby out the bathwater. I think it's always the case, isn't it, that when you've had a bad result and you've got a 2-week international break, it's all people talk about, it's all people remember, and it stews, and everybody sort of goes over the same ground. And but it's a big one really against Millwall, just to turn that tide. I've often heard Sunderland described as like an oil tanker, and it is. Once you get a going, it's very hard to stop. But it's also very hard to start again when it has stopped. Very hard to turn around when it's pointing the wrong way, as we know over the years. Hopefully the oil tanker just needs a nudge in the right direction against Millwall.
Hopefully. And it's mad as well, we're talking about all these injuries. We haven't even mentioned the fact that Enzo Lafayette has been missing for
exactly. And Serkin obviously going off against Coventry City. And I meant to mention this at the time you mentioned Alan Brown, but I was really surprised by Lebris that he didn't play Alan Brown from the start against Coventry. I thought that's a change he would make. He didn't. As you say, that midfield just looks like it needs freshening up with Job and Rigg. And then he brought him on as a right winger in the second half, which I thought was a bit bizarre. But he's probably forgotten more than I know about football, as Reggie. So we'll give him a pass on that one.
Yeah, we will. You mentioned Dennis Serkin there. I just kind of want to talk about him. So there's a few lines from the international break, a few call-ups that I just sort of want to pick your brains on. We'll start with Dennis Serkin, because you've really got a feel for the lad, haven't you? He's got his first call-up for England under 21s. Feels like a really positive step, and a deserved step as well, for my money, in his career. And then he's obviously gone off injured against Coventry on Saturday afternoon, and Sunderland have since confirmed that he now basically is dipped out of that England camp. He won't be part of it. And like I say, just awful timing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I do feel for the lad. I think his call-ups warranted over the course of the season. I do feel like he has been perhaps not at his usual standard after his wrist surgery or his hand surgery. I think he's come back and done okay, but he hasn't sort of hit those heights that he had earlier on in the season. I mean, that Coventry game at home when he scored that goal was brilliant, and around then his levels were sort of through the roof. But just maybe like Sunderland hasn't really hit those heights consistently towards the back end of the season in this little run. But he's a player that I like. He's a player whereby Sunderland's defence is always going to be better when he's fit and available for selection. He's streets ahead of Leo Hjelde, with all respect to Leo Hjelde, and I think his injury would be a blow if he isn't back for Millwall. Obviously, Sunderland haven't really noted the extent of his injury yet, so you never know. His withdrawal from England under 21s could be one in which they've said basically don't play him because we're going to need him for Millwall, we need to protect him, all of that sort of stuff. You hope that's the case, and it's with a view to him being fit for the Championship. And the worst case scenario was that he's been withdrawn because he's going to be injured for a while, which obviously we don't have that information yet. I think what's positive from Lebris's standpoint is that he did strongly hint that Hjelde will be back, so he could probably play in that left-back position. He's looked okay. Obviously got that assist against Sheffield Wednesday. He's probably going to look better the more he plays, in fairness to him, because he's been so in and out the side, hasn't he? Other option you could have Luke O'Nien going over a left-back, but then you're short on centre-backs then, aren't you, with Jensen Seelt only having just returned. It would be a big ask to throw him in against Millwall. He came on in the second half against Coventry City, obviously, but I don't think that was the plan at all, to be honest. I think that was enforced more than anything. So all of a sudden, that defence, where you thought it was well stocked, like it's starting to look a bit, the cupboard's looking a bit barer than it did, isn't it? It's with Ballard being out. He's expected to be a little bit longer than Lefay, isn't he? So like maybe he's 2 or 3 weeks behind. So I don't know. Lefay might be back for Millwall. He might be back for West Brom. But yeah, it's like with injuries, it's like you get given one thing, but you get two things taken away, isn't it? With Sunderland, like, we had this brilliant French centre midfielder playing on the left wing, and then Romain Mundel's injured, but he comes back, and then Lefay gets injured, and it's just like, oh great, we can now choose from Luke O'Nien, Dan Ballard, and Chris Meppen, but oh wait, Ballard's out again, and it's so frustrating, isn't it, from a fan perspective, and obviously from their perspective as well, the players.
Absolutely. I was going to say, like, however frustrating it is for us, it must be doubly so for Dennis Serkin himself. I mean, again, that's with the caveat that we don't know the extent of it. Maybe it is a precautionary thing. You hope it's a precautionary thing, because the prospect of him being sidelined again. You know, like you say, he started. Well, first of all, he had such a frustrating season last time out. He then came back this season. He started like a steam train. He was just unplayable at times in the early knockings of the season. And then, like you say, he little bit disrupted. Probably hasn't quite been at the same level since, but is still, you know, far and away Sunderland's best left back. And when he's good, he's very, very bloody good. You know what I mean? And like I say, getting that call up, I'm sure would have been a very big deal to him. And I guess you just got to hope that it's, you know, the next time it comes around, he's in contention again, and he does get that nod. Want to also mention Eliza Mayenda. He's been called up to Spain under 21s for their latest camp. He sort of manifested this one, didn't he? He gave an interview with AS where he the Continental outlet, and he said, like, you know, I want to be in contention, I want to be in that squad. And then 3 or 4 days later, he was in that squad. And I think, again, as we were saying about Sirkin, very much a nod that is entirely warranted.
Yeah, really impressive season for him. I think his numbers this season are absolutely fantastic. I've been hugely impressed just with his general play and his ability to bounce back from big moments that haven't gone his way. I mean, the stick he got after the Blackburn Rovers game, he missed the chance. That game ended 2-2. I think that was on Boxing Day, wasn't it? And then not long after, to go to Stoke, we lost at Stoke. The mood was pretty glib. He missed a chance. You know, the stick he was getting was you know, some of it justified in terms of constructive criticism, but a lot of it as well as your usual not fit to wear the shirt, send them back to the under-21s, all of this sort of stuff. To bounce back from that has been really, really impressive. And just as, I mean, me and Phil have discussed this on the podcast as well, as his career arc really at Sunderland has been really interesting. He came in, obviously, under Tony Mowbray, didn't play a lot at all, was behind Hemir, goes to Hibs. It doesn't work out for him there at all. He comes back to Sunderland. He starts under Labrise at the start of the season and during pre-season as well. Really impresses, and he's got like raw quality, hasn't he? He's got raw pace. He can finish. He's only going to get better. Really, really nice guy to talk to as well. Very level-headed, down to earth. I asked him, I think, about his time at Hibs and what he made of that, whether it was tough, and he was actually really, really grateful for the opportunity. Really grateful for the different experience of playing in a different league and working under a different coach and staff and all of that sort of stuff. And that really impressed me, actually, in a sense that, like, he's managed to take something positive from that situation, which on paper might not have necessarily looked like it had gone very well, but he's still trying to sort of to get something out of it. So I really like him as a person from the brief conversation I had with him, and I think as a player he's fantastic. But it's a bit of a debate, that one now, isn't it? Like Wilson Isidore and Eliza Mayenda, who's Labrise going to pick? I'd probably bring, I don't know what I'd do. I'd probably bring Isidore back in to play Millwall and have Mayenda on the bench. I don't think I'd go 4-4-2. I think that experiment in my head's over now. But yeah, Mayenda's been class. And he deserves that Spain under-21 call-up. And I think, like, don't be surprised in the summer if this team's linked with him, because it's already sort of started, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. It has. And I think that, you know, the biggest compliment you can pay him is that he has forced that debate about whether or not he should be starting over Isidore, you know, and I don't think that anybody necessarily over the summer would have anticipated that, but you can't argue with the quality of his performances. You can't argue with his work ethic. You can't argue with the way that he applies himself. And the thing that I always think about him is, you know, the rate at which he is developing and the rate at which he seems to be getting to grips with the Championship as a division. You know, hopefully he won't be in the Championship next season. Hopefully someone will be in the Premier League. But the rate that he seems to be getting to grips with it, what's he going to be like in 12 months' time? What's he going to be like in 2 years' time when he's still only 21? You know, there's a huge amount of potential there, and it is massively, massively exciting. Another one that I wanted to ask you about, James, a bit of an interesting one, this from sort of a failed Hibs loanee to a very, very successful one. Nectar Triantis. He has received his first senior call-up to the Australian squad. I think that anybody who's paid even half attention to him up in Scotland this season would suggest that is very much something which is deserved. He's been instrumental in Hibernian's push towards Europe this term. I mean, the big question around him going into the summer is going to be whether or not he has enough to bring that back to Sunderland and force his way into Labrissa's plans, because he's got this new position as a deep lying midfielder. It's a position that, we've already alluded to the fact that Sunderland perhaps could do with another body just to help with rotation and that. And if Triantis could come back and be that player, it would certainly be an interesting one, wouldn't it?
I think he's definitely worth a look in pre-season, isn't he? Obviously, he's playing in central midfield now. He was brought to Sunderland as a defender. He found opportunities hard to come by, didn't he? That's why he was sent out on loan to Hibs. And yeah, he definitely warrants that chance because he's done everything you want of a loanee, hasn't he, really? I mean, if he doesn't warrant a chance at Sunderland in pre-season and at the beginning of next season, then I think you just have to let him go to Hibs permanently, don't you? Because or go elsewhere. I think, it was clearly a long-term signing, though, so I can't envisage a scenario in which Sunderland don't take another look at him, because he looks to me, I haven't seen him too often, but I've read the reports and I've spoken to Hibs fans as well and watched him the odd time, but he's doing so well. And Scotland's such a good breeding ground for players. Like, in terms of a league that's going to get you championship ready, like the Scottish Premier League's probably right up there. Just the intensity, the pace. There's a lot of players go up to Scotland from English football, and they're just like, they can't cope with the speed of it and the sort of the passion, the way it goes sort of end to end. It's a bit of a throwback league in a sense, and I mean that in the best possible way. It's like it's intense and it's fun to watch, and I think the Championship's got a bit of that about it as well. And if he can do it up there, then I think there's every chance that he can have a good career down here. I think with Triantis, so he really wants to play, doesn't he? And I think that's probably the reason why he's been to Hibs. But yeah, certainly worth a look. And a decent player. I think when he's played for Sunderland, I think he came on. Did he come on at home to Birmingham City as a substitute, or did he start that game? I can't remember. No, I know what I'm thinking of. He started at home against Birmingham City, didn't he? And he came on as a sub, I think, on Boxing Day against Hull City and halved somebody under Michael Beale, which broke the game up, and Sunderland ended up winning it because Jack Clark had already scored. But there's definitely a raw player there, I think, and he's well worth his Australia call up as well.
Definitely. He's going from strength to strength at Easter Road. Should we finish up with some under-21s, Chad? I know you were at Ebbleton earlier in the week. They beat Leeds United 3-0. Very comprehensive display. A couple of goals for Finn Garagusian, who appears to have taken the under-21s out of duck to water. Strike for Harrison Jones as well. Obviously, captain of the team. He's been involved with the first team quite a bit already this season. Just sort of wanted to get your opinion on the squad writ large and which players in Graham Murty's team at the moment are really catching your eye, which ones you think are capable of perhaps being the next on this conveyor belt of talent that maybe takes the step up into Regis Labrissa's thinking.
Yeah, I think there's a couple that have really caught my eye this season. Obviously, people will be aware of Trey Ogunsui. He's just picked up an injury at the moment, but he came on in the FA Cup game at the Stadium of Light against Stoke. He's done really well for the under-21s. He can play off the right through the middle. He's just got sort of everything you'd want from a young striker, and he's got a way to develop and a way to grow. He's been fantastic, to be honest. But then Finn Garagusian behind him as well, who's 17. He was playing under-16s football last season, and he's been playing for the under-18s this season as well as the 21s, and he's just looked amazing. Sometimes I think you see youth football, and it can be, not all of the time, it can be very passive and very technical. And I'm not saying Garagusian isn't technical, because he is, but he just goes after games. His desire and his work rate and his pace for a big lad as well. I think he's 6'2" already. Really, really impressed by him. I'm not saying you're going to see him in the first team next week or anything, but I think he's definitely one to keep an eye on. Sunderland fans will be fairly familiar with Harrison Jones now. I think he's played 3 times for the first team in the Cups, and he made his league debut off the bench against Sheffield Wednesday. Excuse me. But he's a really good technical player, can play in a multitude of positions. He can play as an 8. He could probably play as a 6 as well, can definitely play as a 10. And against Leeds United, he actually played as a false 9. He got an assist and a goal, and he just makes things happen. He's a boyhood Sunderland fan as well, which always helps. It's his dream to play for Sunderland, and he's doing that alongside his brother Jayden Jones as well in the middle, who's not a bad player at all, actually. Another one that's really impressed us in recent weeks, actually, and I've watched him for a long time, but I'm really starting to appreciate him now, is Jensen Jones. So there's Harrison Jones, Jaden Jones, who are brothers, and then there's Jensen Jones, and that's always very difficult, especially when the three of them were named on the same team sheet against Leeds. But Jensen Jones can play left back, right back. He's played centre midfield, and then against Leeds, he also went to left wing and got an assist as well. So he's just so ridiculously technical that he can play in all these different positions, which is obviously really, really handy to have. He's really, really come on in recent weeks, I would say. Again, probably has a little bit of growing to do. Physicality of his game probably needs to be improved on, but he's a top prospect. And Ollie Bainbridge as well, who got a little bit of first team experience with Kilmarnock earlier on in the season, played at Celtic Park. I think he played 6 or 7 times up there before coming back in January. He can play left back, right back, centre back. He was a big player when the under-21s got the Premier League playoff final against Tottenham. They ended up losing, but he's a really, really good handy player. A little bit like Sirkin, I think, in a little way. They both wear Alice bands at times, so that's probably why. But honestly, it's so fun to watch the under-21s because they are just full of talent. Graham Murphy does a great job. Luke Bell, actually, the centre back, he's really come on. He's a good player. And then there's others as well, like Zach Johnson's out on loan at Notts County as well. I really, really, really like him. Tom Lavery's a good player. Ben Crompton's out on loan. So there's so much talent there. But I think for me, the standout in recent weeks has been Finn Garagousian because he's just been this phenomenon. In terms of just contributing and imprinting his will on a game, he's doing it way beyond his years, and he's got time to grow and time to learn, and very, very impressive. And not really doing anything too flashy either, just doing the basics really well, just getting the ball, running at players, being in the right place, being on the end of it, and can play in a couple of positions across the forward line. So yeah, it's nice to watch these youngsters come through. It really is.
Absolutely. I think the Garagousian, and to be fair, I think you could say pretty much the same thing about Ogunsui. You're always hesitant to hype up these young players too much at such a sort of formative time in their career because you don't want to apply that pressure. And obviously, I do think there is an awful lot of merit to allowing them to develop sort of away from the limelight and almost away from fan attention to a certain extent so that they can really, reach their full potential without having to deal with the sort of the surrounding, limelight really. But I do think that where Sunderland differ from most clubs and why it's perhaps that little bit more exciting is because, there is such a reliance on youth. And, we're talking about Garagousian, he's 17 now. He's only a couple of years younger than Eliza Mayenda,
And he's the same age as Chris Rigg. That's the mental thing.
Exactly. We've already seen it with, in very recent times, Chris Rigg, Tommy Watson, these young academy lads who have made such an impact at youth level that they've almost forced their way into being in a position where they have to be under consideration for the first team because you can't ignore them any longer. And that's why, with the Garagousian, you kind of want to take your foot off the gas a little bit and you want to be a little bit realistic about it. But at the same time, it's hard to ignore what you're seeing on a weekly basis. And if he's going to keep on influencing matches in the way that he is, similar thing with Ogunsui, if he's going to keep on scoring goals in the manner that he has this season, it is going to get to a point where, it might not be this year, it might not be next year, but we are going to get to a point, presumably sooner rather than later, where they are knocking on the door of that first team squad. And like I say, that's probably where Sunderland differs a little bit from a lot of the clubs around them, but it does make for a really exciting prospect, I think.
Yeah, and I didn't even mention Matty Young as well, who's probably one of the best young goalkeepers in the country, out on loan at Salford. I think he's probably seen as the natural long-term successor to Anthony Patterson one day. I'm not trying to sell Anthony Patterson off early or anything like that, but yeah, the depth of talent at Sunderland is ridiculous, and it's really nice to see that pathway utilised. As you mentioned, I think the ownership have done an absolutely tremendous job with the academy. It's very vibrant. Credit to Graham Murphy as well, who just drives standards in that group. You've got Finn Lynch as well running the under-18s alongside his partner, in coaching crime, whose name I've forgot, Jordan Moore, that's it. The academy manager, Robin Nichols, it's such a vibrant space, I think, for those youngsters. And, Sunderland do still lose some of their young talent. It does happen. Mason Kocher, Toby Bell, all of, we won't see success across the board all of the time, but contrast it to the Madrox era where Sunderland were just losing all of their players. Pretty much everyone went, barring Dan Neil, essentially, of that really talented youth group with Sam Greenwood, Lucas Stevenson, Joe Hugel, all of those players. But now Sunderland have a real chance of holding on to them and progressing them into the first team. And for me, that's like, we've got to be realistic about things. I think hopefully in my lifetime, Sunderland will have some form of success at the highest level. Like, I really hope they do. And obviously, I really hope they win promotion for the Championship. But for me, I get my sort of enjoyment from watching the young lads come through and, coming into the first team and playing for Sunderland's first team, especially when the boyhood fans, that's the type of story that I really like, in the absence of something like massive, which probably isn't on the cards yet. Hopefully it will be in my lifetime one day, but yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the dream, isn't it? Grow up a Sunderland fan, play for Sunderland. That's all we've got time for on this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing all of the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, follow all the latest Black Cats news on the Sunderland Echo, or give us a follow on social media as well. Thanks to James. Thanks to you for listening. We'll see you next week.